During my hospital stay, my parents sold my $18,000 engagement ring to pay for my brother's dream party. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from today. I love seeing the different places people watch from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Now please stick with me till the end because this story still makes me emotional to tell. I woke up to the sound of a heart monitor beeping too fast, and for a few seconds I didn't know where I was. The ceiling was the wrong color. The air smelled like antiseptic and something sweeter underneath it, like hand sanitizer trying too hard. My whole body felt like it had been run through a washing machine on the wrong cycle. Then it came back to me in pieces. The wet road. The headlights that weren't supposed to be in my lane. The sound of metal folding like paper. My name is Ruth. I'm 27 years old, and 3 days before that accident, I had been the happiest I'd ever been in my life. I was engaged. Sawyer had proposed to me on a Tuesday, which he said on purpose, because he wanted our story to be about an ordinary day turning into an extraordinary one. He'd used his late grandmother's ring, a thin gold band with a single round diamond that had survived 2 wars and 3 generations of women in his family. It wasn't flashy. It was the kind of ring that made jewelers pause and ask where it came from. $18,000 was what it had been appraised for, but to me it was worth more than that. It was worth everything. I reached up instinctively to touch it the way I did 100 times a day since he'd put it on my finger. My hand brushed against the hospital blanket, then my own skin, then nothing. The ring was gone. For a moment I told myself it was in a lockbox somewhere, that a nurse had taken it off before surgery, that this was normal hospital procedure. My hand shook a little as I pressed the call button, and a nurse came in, kind-faced, maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. "Where's my ring?" I asked her. My voice sounded like gravel. She checked her chart, checked a small manila envelope taped to the side of my bed labeled personal effects. Inside were my earrings, a hair tie, and $11 in cash. No ring. "Sometimes family members hold on to jewelry for safekeeping," she said gently. "Do you have someone who visited?" I did. My mother, Lynn, had been the first person at the hospital after Sawyer. She'd sat by my bed for the first 2 days while I drifted in and out of consciousness from the surgery on my leg and the concussion that had scrambled my memory of the crash itself. When she walked in that afternoon with a coffee in each hand, I noticed something before she even sat down. She wouldn't look directly at me. My mother has never in her life avoided eye contact with anyone, not even people she was actively lying to at church potlucks about her potato salad recipe. But she avoided mine. "Mom," I said. "Where's my ring?" She set the coffees down very carefully, like she was buying herself time. "Sweetheart, you've been through a lot. Let's not worry about jewelry right now." "Mom." My voice cracked, not from sadness yet, just confusion. "Where is my ring?" And that's when her face went pale, the same pale it goes when she burns something in the oven and hopes nobody notices the smoke alarm. She sat down slowly in the chair beside my bed, and I watched her rehearse 3 different sentences in her head before she landed on one. "There were some bills," she started. "The insurance didn't cover everything from the accident, and your father and I didn't want you to wake up to that stress, so we took care of some things. You sold my ring to pay medical bills?" Something in my chest loosened slightly. It was still wrong, still something they should have asked me about, but at least it made a kind of sense. At least it was for me. She didn't answer right away, and that hesitation told me everything before her mouth caught up. "Not exactly," she finally said. "It was mostly for Reed's party." I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark that hurt my ribs. Reed's party. My brother Reed was turning 25 in 3 weeks, and for months he'd been talking about wanting a real adult milestone celebration. A venue with string lights, a live band, a raw bar, the whole production. My parents had been quietly stressed about the cost of it for weeks. I just never imagined the solution they landed on was my engagement ring. "It wasn't like that," my mother said quickly. "We were going to replace it. We just needed the cash fast, and Sawyer's ring was just sitting in the safe not doing anything." "It wasn't sitting there, Mom, it was on my finger 3 days ago." My voice was rising now, and the heart monitor picked up the pace, beeping faster, betraying me. "It's not costume jewelry. It's his grandmother's. It's not replaceable." She started crying the way she always did when she was caught rather than when she was actually sorry. I'd seen that particular crying face my whole life and I knew the difference by now. The door opened and Sawyer walked in with a paper bag of takeout soup because the hospital food had made me gag the day before. He took one look at my face, then my mother's, and set the bag down slowly. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. A demand dressed up as a question. I couldn't even say it out loud yet. I just looked at my bare hand and he understood immediately, the way people who love you sometimes understand things faster than words can carry them. I asked to be alone. That night, once the room was quiet except for the monitors, I lay there replaying the moment he'd proposed. It had been 8 months earlier in his childhood backyard under a string of lights. He'd hung himself badly so they drooped in the middle like a smile. He'd knelt down and his hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped the box. He told me the ring had survived his grandmother crossing an ocean with nothing else to her name, had survived his grandfather's factory job, had survived being hidden in a coffee tin during a house fire in 1974. It had survived everything. It hadn't survived 3 days in my parents' house. I want to tell you something about my family, because this ring wasn't really the beginning of the story. It was just the moment I finally saw the pattern clearly, after 27 years of living inside it without a name for it. Reed is 2 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember he has been the sun that our household orbited. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was more like gravity. My parents didn't wake up and decide to love him more. They just always seemed to notice him first, worry about him first, celebrate him first, and I grew up learning to take up as little space as possible so there'd be room for whatever he needed. When I graduated college, magna cum laude, having worked 2 jobs the entire 4 years to avoid taking loans, my parents came to the ceremony 40 minutes late because Reed had gotten into a minor fender bender that morning and needed emotional support before they could leave the house. By the time they arrived, I'd already crossed the stage. My mother cried, apologizing, but somehow the story that got told at Thanksgiving that year wasn't about my degree. It was about how stressful Reed's little accident had been for everyone. When I got my first real job out of college, an entry-level marketing position I'd fought hard for against candidates with more experience, my father's first comment was, "That's nice, honey, but you know Reed's interview is next week too, right? Keep your fingers crossed for him." I did keep my fingers crossed for him. That's the part that used to confuse me. I never resented Reed himself. He's not a villain in the traditional sense. He's just a person who was taught gently and consistently that he mattered more and who never had a reason to question it. I was the responsible one. The one who paid her own way. The one who didn't need to be checked on. And somewhere along the way, doesn't need to be checked on, turned into, doesn't need to be considered at all. Down the hall, I could hear Sawyer's voice, low and controlled but sharp at the edges, talking to my father in the hallway outside my room. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough. "How could you? Do you understand what that ring meant? She just had surgery and you were worried about a party." My father's voice came back defensive, mumbling something about how they'd make it right eventually. I closed my eyes and let the tears come finally quietly so no one would hear me. Not because of the ring. Because I finally understood in a way I couldn't unknow, exactly where I stood in my own family. Somewhere below a birthday party. I was discharged 5 days later with a leg brace, 6 weeks of physical therapy ahead of me, and a hairline fracture in my trust for my own parents that no cast could fix. I moved back into my childhood bedroom temporarily to recover, since our apartment had stairs Sawyer and I hadn't finished retrofitting, and every day in that house felt like walking through a museum exhibit of my own erasure. I heard my mother on the phone with my aunt, gushing about the caterer she'd booked for Reed's party, about the band, about the custom cake with gold drip icing that cost more than my last car payment. Not one mention of my surgery. Not one mention that her daughter had nearly died on a rain-slicked highway 2 weeks earlier. I found my father in the kitchen one evening and asked him directly, "Why didn't you ask me? Before you sold it? Why didn't you just ask?" He set down his coffee mug with the particular carefulness of a man building an argument in his head. "Ruth, be reasonable. The party was already half paid for. The venue, the band. If we cancelled at that point we'd have lost the deposits and still owed the balance. It would have been humiliating in front of everyone we invited." "Humiliating," I repeated. "More humiliating than pawning your daughter's engagement ring while she's unconscious in a hospital bed?" "You weren't unconscious the whole time," he said, which was somehow the least reassuring thing he could have said. "That's not the point, Dad. The point," he said, voice rising, "is that we're a family and families help each other and you've always been the strong one, Ruth. You've never needed us to worry about you the way Reed does. There was. Stated plainly, almost proudly, like it was a compliment instead of a confession. I had been punished my whole life for being capable. My mother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. You're always so dramatic about things, she said. We'll pay you back. We just need time. I didn't say anything else. I went back to my room, and for the first time since the accident I felt something other than grief. It was quieter than anger. It felt more like clarity. That night I heard the front door open and close softly. Sawyer had left without saying goodbye to my parents. When I texted him he said only, "Give me a few days. I have an idea." Trust me. I did. I always had. What I didn't know yet was that Sawyer had found the pawn shop receipt 3 days earlier, tucked into the inside pocket of my father's good coat, the one he wore to church and to funerals. My father, it turned out, was not a careful man when it came to hiding evidence of his own guilt. The receipt led Sawyer to a shop called Corbett & Sons 40 minutes outside town, the kind of place with a bell over the door and a man behind bulletproof glass who'd seen every kind of desperate transaction imaginable. Sawyer told me later that when he described the ring, thin gold band, single round diamond, an old inscription worn nearly smooth on the inside, the owner's face changed. Somebody's grandmother's ring, the man said. I could tell soon as they brought it in. People don't sell rings like that unless something's wrong. It hadn't sold yet. Pawn shops hold items for a period before they go up for resale, and Sawyer had gotten there with 4 days to spare. He paid the full redemption amount without telling me, using savings that had been earmarked for our wedding venue deposit. He didn't tell me any of this until the ring was already back in a small velvet box in his coat pocket. Meanwhile I had quietly started to change. I stopped crying about it and started writing things down instead. Dates, amounts, patterns. I remembered every time money had moved in my family's history, and I started to see how much of it had always flowed one direction. The car my parents bought Reed at 19 after he wrecked his first one twice. The rent they'd covered for him, just until he got on his feet, which turned into 3 years. The ring now sold without a single phone call to me first. I called a family friend named Iris, who'd become a paralegal a few years back after a rough divorce reroute her whole career. We met for coffee and I laid it all out for her. Dry, factual, the way you'd describe a stranger's problem instead of your own life. Legally, she said, stirring sugar into her mug slowly, if it was a gift given specifically to you, not community property, not a family heirloom held jointly, then what they did could be considered conversion. Theft in plain terms. Doesn't matter that they're your parents. I sat with that for a long moment. I hadn't been thinking about lawsuits or restitution. I just wanted to understand the shape of what had happened to me. But hearing her say the word theft out loud applied to my own parents, cracked something open that I couldn't close back up. I'm not trying to destroy them, I told her. I know, she said. But you deserve to know your own power here. What you do with it is up to you. The 3 weeks leading up to Reed's party were some of the strangest of my life. On the surface everything looked normal. I went to 2 separate planning dinners where my mother described centerpiece options in exhausting detail while I nodded along, smiling in the specific practiced way you smile when you're holding something enormous underneath a very calm surface. At home when no one was watching I kept building my case with Iris. Not out of vengeance exactly, but out of a need to finally have proof on paper of something that had only ever lived as a feeling before. We gathered the pawn shop receipt, dated financial statements showing the ring's sale, records from years back showing the disproportionate spending on Reed versus me, and a written timeline of the hospital conversation, dated and detailed while it was still fresh enough to be credible. Then one quiet Thursday evening, Sawyer asked me to sit down at our kitchen table. He didn't make a speech. He just slid a small velvet box across the table toward me, the same one from 8 months earlier. I opened it and there it was. The gold band. The single round diamond. Worn smooth on the inside where a woman I never met had worn it for decades before it made its way to me. You didn't have to do that, I whispered even as I was already sliding it back onto my finger, where it had always belonged. I know, he said. I wanted to. Some things can't be replaced with money. I wanted you to know that at least one person in your life understands that. I cried for a long time that night, but it wasn't only grief anymore. Somewhere in the middle of it, I made a decision. This wasn't about the ring being back. This was about making sure I was never treated like an afterthought in my own family again. I decided to go to the party. Not to cause a scene in the traditional sense, not to scream or throw a plate across a room like something out of a movie. I decided to go because I wanted my parents to feel, just for a moment, exactly what it felt like to have something taken from you when you least expect it. Quietly and in front of people who mattered to them. I RSVP'd with a warm, cheerful message. I bought Reed a gift, wrapped it nicely, a watch he'd mentioned wanting months earlier. I told my mother I was looking forward to it, and I meant every word of that sentence because in a strange way I was. Iris helped me put together a formal packet, a restitution request for the ring's assessed value, along with copies of the pawn shop receipt and a clear, unemotional letter outlining what had happened and what accountability would look like moving forward. We arranged for it to be hand-delivered to my parents' home the evening of the party, time to arrive while the event was in full swing, when there would be no quiet corner to sweep it under. The night of the party I wore a soft green dress, my hair curled the way my mother always liked it, and my ring back on my finger where everyone could see it. I hugged Reed at the door and told him happy birthday, and I meant that too. This was never about him, not really. It was about the two people who had taught him without meaning to, that some children are worth more than others. I mingled. I smiled. I let my guard down just enough that my parents relaxed around me for the first time in weeks, believing, I think, that I had finally moved on the way they'd hoped I would. Quietly, the way I always had. The courier arrived a little after 9 that evening, right in the thick of the party, when the band was between sets and half the guests were gathered near the dessert table admiring the towering, absurdly expensive cake my ring had helped pay for. My father answered the door, assuming it was a delivery for the party. Extra champagne maybe, or a forgotten catering item. He signed for the envelope with a pen from his jacket pocket, still smiling from a conversation with an old golf buddy, and opened it right there in the entryway in front of at least a dozen people drifting in and out for air. I watched his face change in real time. Confusion first, then recognition, then something closer to panic as he skimmed the restitution letter, the receipt, the plain unemotional language Iris had helped me write. He tried to fold it quickly, tuck it back into the envelope, but my mother had already noticed his expression and crossed the room to see what was wrong. "What is that?" she said, low though not low enough. "Nothing," he said. "We'll talk about it later." But my Aunt Odette, my father's older sister, a woman who had never once in her life been able to leave well enough alone, God bless her, leaned over and caught sight of the pawn shop letterhead before he could hide it fully. "Is that a pawn receipt?" she said too loudly, the way people do after 2 glasses of champagne. "Whose is that?" My mother's face went the same pale it had gone in the hospital room weeks earlier. And in the sudden quiet that spreads through a party when something has gone visibly, irreversibly wrong, Odette looked between my parents and me, standing calmly by the dessert table with my ring catching the light. "Dennis," she said to my father, using his full name the way family does when they already suspect the answer and want it confirmed out loud, "please tell me you didn't sell that girl's engagement ring." Nobody answered her. Nobody needed to. The silence answered for them. The party didn't end immediately, but it changed shape entirely. Guests drifted toward the edges of the room, pretending not to listen while listening intently, the way people do at every family gathering when something real finally surfaces. My parents pulled me into the kitchen away from the crowd, though not far enough to stop the whispering. My mother's voice was somewhere between pleading and furious. "Why would you do this here? Tonight? Couldn't this have waited?" "I waited weeks," I said, and my voice didn't shake the way it used to when I confronted them. "I waited while you bought a 5-tier cake and hired a live band and never once asked how my surgery went. I waited while you told everyone how excited you were for Reed's 25th and never mentioned your daughter almost died on the highway. I'm done waiting for a version of you that considers me too." Reed appeared in the doorway then, still in his nice shirt, the birthday boy caught between 2 versions of a night he hadn't planned on having. He looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there wasn't confidence in his face. There was something closer to shame. "I knew," he said quietly to no one and everyone. "I knew it was your ring, Ruth. I saw it in the safe drawer and then it wasn't there anymore and Mom told me not to say anything. I should have said something." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was more honesty than I'd heard from him in years, and I appreciated it more than he probably realized. My father tried once more to justify it. Something about family, about sacrifice, about how he never imagined it would blow up like this. I let him finish. Then I said the thing I'd been building toward for 3 weeks without even realizing it. This was never about the money, I told them, and I meant it completely. You can pay me back every dollar and it still won't fix what this proved. I don't need you to pay me back with interest. I need you to actually see me. And until you can do that, until you can treat me like I matter as much as he does, without a crisis forcing you to remember I exist, I'm not coming to family things anymore. Not out of anger. Out of self-respect. I walked out of that kitchen, past the whispering guests, past the cake, and I didn't look back. The weeks after that weren't like a fairy tale. Real healing in a family never is. My father called 2 days later. He didn't make excuses. He just said, I was wrong. I should have asked you first. I'm sorry, and I mean it. He came to my apartment alone without my mother and sat with me at the kitchen table. He paid back the full value of the ring. I didn't even ask him to. He said it was simply the right thing to do. My mother took longer to change. Her apology came with a little defensiveness, a little, you have to understand our side. It wasn't perfect, but I accepted it for what it was. Healing isn't one conversation. It's many small choices over time. Reed and I talked to just the two of us. He didn't make excuses either. He said he wanted to do better, to notice things instead of assuming life would always go his way. I don't know yet if that will last. Time will tell. Sawyer and I are planning our wedding again. The real ring is back on my finger every day, and it means even more to me now. Sometimes I look at it in the evening light and think about everything it survived to find its way back to me. It's not just a ring anymore. It's proof that some things are worth fighting for. And that setting a boundary can be the most powerful thing you ever do. Telling the people who raised you, I am not an afterthought anymore. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me. I'd love to know what you would have done in my place. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.